Okay, thank you all. At this point, we will be moving on to our second topic area, the humans and societal impact of AI. We're going to start with a series of short talks by Stanford faculty. So first, I'd like to introduce Juliana Bidadanure, who is my colleague in the philosophy department. She's an assistant professor of philosophy and, by courtesy, of political science. And she's the faculty director of the Stanford Basic Income Lab.
Hello, everyone. I want to spend my 5 minutes discussing an old policy proposal that was revived in the US very recently. It's called Universal Basic Income, or UBI, and it can be traced all the way back to Thomas Paine, and it was picked up much later on by Milton Friedman and MLK Jr., among others, and it wasn't quite discussed over the next decades. And that changed over the past 3 years or so when the proposal was put forward by many personalities in the US as a potential response to the growing worry that AI and automation would massively displace workers from the labor market. Now, as many of you know, numerous reports warn us that AI could have a tremendous impact on employment, both by replacing some jobs entirely and by replacing tasks within other jobs as well, so that the overall need for human labor could dramatically decrease. Now, the future of work is also likely a lot like the present of work, that is precarious. Too many jobs are, and will likely continue to be, degrading, boring, poorly paid. Now, UBI helps with those problems by securing a floor below which no one is allowed to fall. It increases economic security for workers who stand to lose their jobs. It helps those who barely make ends meet. It offers exit options for workers with particularly bad jobs. And if it's set sufficiently high, it could even help increase workers' bargaining power so that they may demand better working conditions. Now, we now know that almost half of Americans support a UBI for workers displaced by AI. An UBI is a very simple proposal. It's a recurring cash grant given to all members of a community without means test and no strings attached. So you can think of $1,000 a month unconditionally. Now, there is a lot of resistance to the idea of giving people cash, no strings attached. Most people say that they would continue to work when they are asked, what would you do if you were to receive a UBI? But when people are asked what others would do with their UBI, now the answer is very different. It would be a disaster. People would watch Netflix all day, and they would take up drinking, and the economy would collapse. So now, what does the evidence say? What do people actually do when they are given an unrestricted cash grant? So luckily, UBI experiments have been conducted in countries as different as Finland, Kenya, India, and Canada. And we also know a lot from a wealth of unconditional cash experiments throughout the world. What they find, spoiler alert, people don't drink more and they don't watch Netflix all day. They, in fact, do not withdraw en masse from the labor market. And there is also ample evidence that people do not use the cash on temptation goods like alcohol and cigarettes. But there are also many areas of uncertainty. First, these findings from different places at different times will not necessarily be very good at predicting what would happen in different places in the US right now. Second, besides labor effects, there are many more interesting questions that need to be answered about what UBI could and could not achieve. So I'm thinking about the impact UBI could have on stigma, crime, health, education, gender equity, racial equity. But excitingly, many of us are working on a new phase of UBI experimentation in the US. And so hopefully we'll find out more about UBI can do very soon. So Y Combinator Research has just finished a feasibility study in Auckland and is now planning to experiment with a large randomized control trial in 2 sites in the US. The city of Stockton, California, under the leadership of Mayor Michael Tubbs, has launched a city demonstration where their community is going to engage in a reflection about the future of work and the meaninglessness of work and deservingness. There's a very interesting, very small demonstration also happening in Jackson, Mississippi, where the Springboard for Opportunity is going to give 16 black mothers a UBI, no strings attached. And the city of Chicago is also assembling a task force to explore the possibility of a UBI pilot. And there are many more such projects bubbling up throughout the country. Now, 2 years ago, at the Stanford Basic Income Lab, we convened city leaders and experimenters from throughout the country, including many of those that went on to announce experiments later on, to think together about UBI experimentation and implementation in the US. One thing that came out of this is a toolkit called Basic Income in Cities that brings together existing evidence, highlights different models of experimentation, and makes a list of concrete recommendations on how to set up a pilot for those who are ready. I hope that some of you will check it out. Cities can be laboratories of change and experiment the visions that we so dearly need for our future. American cities are already experiencing some of the changes that AI brings to our economy, and they are ready to find creative ways to make sure that their communities come out of these changes empowered rather than marginalized. I think that supporting local communities in those bold and utopian and yet evidence-based attempts to invent a future that works for all is one of the most promising pathways to a human-centered economy. Thank you.
And our next speaker is Mark Duggan, who is a professor of economics. He's the Trioni Director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and the Wayne and Jody Cooperman Professor of Economics. So, Mark.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Duggan, and the work that I'll be presenting today, and there is a clicker here, right? Yes, okay, great. And the work that I'll be presenting today is a joint product with my colleague and CEPR fellow, Ramin Taloui. So at CEPR, we've learned that improving public policy through research requires asking the right questions, answering them in a rigorous way, and then distilling the implications for public policy. What I would like to do today is to lay out a collaborative research agenda with two goals: informing public policy and improving the effectiveness of governments. Establishing the right frame for this research can be difficult given the sometimes fantastical understanding of AI among social scientists and policymakers. Boiling down the essence of AI as the automation of tasks previously dominated by humans makes the subject tractable for the social scientist and situates it within a context in which familiar analytical tools can be applied. We can then systematically investigate the impact of such automation on the labor market, on industrial organization, on income inequality, and on global competition. What I'll do in the first half of my talk is give a rapid-fire overview of these four areas, and for the details, I would encourage you to download the slides. So in recent years, we've already seen how the adoption of information technology reallocated workers in the labor market. For example, spreadsheet software reduced bookkeeping jobs and increased financial analyst ones. Labor economists have demonstrated that information technology contributed to broadly reducing the share of workers in middle-skill occupations, thereby pushing many into lower-skilled and higher-skilled jobs. Looking ahead, work by Oxford, McKinsey, and others have laid out scenarios for the millions of jobs that will inevitably be affected by the introduction of AI. Further research can deepen the study of how conflicting forces of job destruction and job creation net out, what history teaches us about the dynamics and friction in the reallocation process, and in light of this, how policies can help cushion the upcoming transitions. Second, the last few decades have witnessed growing concentration within many important industries in the US and around the world. Artificial intelligence has the potential to amplify these trends. Unlike many other algorithms, performance improvements in deep learning continue to scale with ever greater quantities of data. Combined with the network effects of platform ecosystems, this further increases the competitive benefits of size. Researchers can formalize these propositions into models and testable hypotheses and map out normative implications for the government's role in providing public goods like R&D and open data, as well as for competition and antitrust policy. Naturally, the combination of these forces has implications for income and wealth inequality. Once again, this is not a new issue. Since the late 1970s, we've seen a sharp stratification of income gains, and today, a very large fraction of US households live at the absolute edge of financial insecurity. Economists debate the mix of factors that are responsible for these recent changes, but there are good reasons to believe that AI-driven automation could amplify them going forward. And economists can again help formalize causal channels and inform the discussion of how changes in tax and transfer policies might better achieve social objectives. Finally, AI is poised to challenge the rules of the game for international cooperation and competition. The research agenda here ranges from how global agreements need to adapt to AI-driven commerce to the impact on the political order and competition among nations. The answers that come out of this research agenda have implications for the broad set of policies that government must get right in the AI era. But it is not just about policy. Government is also a massive service provider, accounting for more than 1/3 of our economy, and with an especially large role in healthcare and education, two sectors where, as we heard in the previous session, AI can be a powerful force for improving outcomes. And government possesses the single most important resource in the era of deep learning, massive quantities of data. That data can be put to use to increase efficiency and achieve social objectives in areas including education, safety net programs, environmental regulation, criminal justice, healthcare policy, and much more. The use of algorithms will raise issues about striking the right balance between competing values such as equity and efficiency, privacy and transparency, and so forth. I'm really pleased to say that there is already Stanford-sponsored work to improve the effectiveness of government policy. As Juliana just mentioned, this pilot universal basic income program in Stockton, California, and CEPR is trying to contribute to that effort with a policy fellow there this year. The road ahead involves convening the mix of scholars that can advance this research, as well as educating policymakers about the real issues that are involved with AI. That is what both HI and CEPR are set up to do, with the goal of a government that is more capable of addressing the critical issues of the era of artificial intelligence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. So our next speaker is Jennifer Pan. And Jennifer is the Assistant Professor of Communication and, by courtesy, of Political Science and Sociology. Jennifer?
Okay. So I study how governments try to control information to shape what we know, what we believe, and what we do. For the most part, I study this in China and other non-democratic countries. And it's through the course of doing this work that I've noticed that there's something about the way we talk about the future of AI that doesn't quite match the reality of what I'm seeing. And it comes down to this. People tend to talk about the entities or organizations shaping, advancing, implementing, driving AI as singular, cohesive, unified entities. But in reality, these are complex organizations. They're often flawed, sometimes they're dysfunctional. They're filled with people and individuals who have different motives, different incentives, who are pursuing different goals. So this is what I'm talking about. Whoops, let's go back. These are some headlines about China and AI. China's application of AI should be a Sputnik moment for the US, but will it be? In the struggle for AI supremacy, China will prevail. China is determined to steal AI crown from the US, and nothing, not even a trade war, will stop it. So Bill Gates raised this question of what is Chinese AI? And I think we can even ask the question of what is China in this context? Is China the Chinese Communist Party? Is it companies like Tencent or Alibaba? Is it President Xi Jinping? Or is it some sort of hive mind of 1.4 billion people? Let's assume that when most people are talking about China and AI, they're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is one of the most powerful organizations in the world who's invested in advancing AI. But when we think about the Chinese Communist Party, and I should say this assumption is warranted, the Chinese Communist Party controls the Chinese government, it controls the Chinese military, China's judicial system, China's media, vast portions of China's economy, inside of China's borders. This powerful organization exerts a lot of influence, and increasingly the Chinese Communist Party's influence is felt outside of its borders. But it would be a mistake to think about the Chinese Communist Party as a unitary, singular organization. and it would be a mistake to attribute the outcomes generated by the Chinese Communist Party as a result of unified, cohesive, singular decision-making. In this powerful organization, there are different individuals who are pursuing different and sometimes opposing goals, who are motivated by different and sometimes opposing incentives. And so when we think about what's produced through this powerful entity, we must take into account the incentives of these individuals who are shaping the outcomes of this organization. In the past few years, I've been looking at how the Chinese Communist Party controls information through censorship, propaganda, and disinformation. We've used a lot of machine learning tools to help us uncover the strategies and goals of the system. And what we know is that China is very good at censoring, at disseminating propaganda, at spreading disinformation at scale. But what a lot of people don't understand is that there are a lot of people within the Chinese Communist Party involved in this effort, from county-level bureaucrats to central leaders in Beijing. And oftentimes, they're manipulating information to influence what each other know. So even though we think about censorship, propaganda, and disinformation as oriented toward the public, a lot of what is going on to produce these outcomes is because of internal politics and internal competition and dynamics. So how does something like this play out in China's social credit system? I get asked a lot about social credit in China, and underlying these questions is this fear of a very powerful state with virtually unlimited access to information and the AI to use it. But in reality, there's not one single social credit system in China today. There are, so this is what we're afraid of, the panopticon. Somehow China will build the future panopticon. But there isn't one social credit system in China. There's a multitude of social credit systems that are fragmented in China. Some are created by regional and local governments, others by different ministries and government functions, others by companies, both private and state-owned. And these different actors are competing over data and over technological advances because of the belief that whoever comes out first or in front in this competition will have more influence, more power, make more money. And so when we think about social credit in China, we have to take into account these competitive dynamics that are occurring. And this distinction in how we think about AI and the entities developing AI is really crucial. We shouldn't assume that the entities engaged in this effort are unitary, singular, unified organizations. They're not. So we need to be clear-minded, we need to be realistic in taking into account the individuals within these organizations and the incentives and motives shaping them. And only then can we hope to shape and influence the impact of AI in society. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we decided that giving one speaker 5 minutes was too much, so this next 5-minute slot will be 2 speakers, David Engstrom and Dan Ho. David is a professor of law and associate dean and the Bernard D. Bergreen Faculty Scholar in the Stanford Law School. And Dan is the William Benjamin Scott and Luna M. Scott Professor of Law, a professor of courtesy of political science, and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research.
We're here to talk about 2 collisions. The first is this. These are our students. 15 are law students, and 10 are computer science PhDs. And their worlds are colliding in an interdisciplinary project we're co-leading at the law school, advising the federal government on the use of AI by administrative agencies. So think the SEC or the EPA. Here's the second collision. On the one hand, the body of law that governs agencies is premised on transparency, accountability, and reason-giving. When government takes action that affects our rights, the Constitution and due process say it must explain why. On the other hand, the AI tools that government agencies are increasingly using are not yet, at least, fully explainable. We want to make the case that if law and the AI community can work together to make these collisions productive rather than destructive, we can modernize government in ways that are legal, ethical, and humane.
Exhibit A. The Social Security Administration is the largest adjudication agency in the Western world. Some 1,600 judges make over 500,000 decisions in disability benefits cases annually. Yet such mass adjudication faces serious problems. First, there's a disturbing arbitrariness in grant rates when cases are randomly assigned. This figure depicts grant rates across judges in one region, with one judge granting benefits 8% of the time, and another granting benefits 98% of the time for the same types of cases, leading some to decry this as a system of disability roulette. Second, due process is resource intensive. Here's the file room from another mass adjudicatory agency for veterans' claims, where it takes an average of 7 years to resolve a veteran's appeal. With our student team, we're studying the ways to improve this state of affairs. One success story comes from the former head of the SSA Appeals Council, who hired lawyers who could code. They developed a machine learning model that identifies cases in which benefits should clearly be granted, thus eliminating the need for a resource and time-intensive hearing. And another program uses natural language processing to catch errors in draft decisions by judges, such as in this pop-up to please reevaluate a particular issue. NLP may someday draft decisions more accurately than the status quo. These developments are interesting not just as an application of AI, but because they could shift our understanding of the Constitution itself. The Supreme Court once articulated 2 rationales for the right to a hearing under the Constitution: accuracy and dignity. But the last 50 years have seen a fixation on accuracy. AI can improve accuracy, but it can also free up resources, allowing us to reclaim the lost constitutional rationale of dignity. As one judge told us, litigants regularly appear in front of her and say, "I know that I will lose, but I just want to be heard."
Exhibit B. Enforcement is critical to governance. Too little of it means costly law breaking. But going after the wrong people is also costly and unfair. And so agencies are developing algorithmic tools to help predict environmental violations, healthcare fraud, and even which of you will cheat on your taxes next month. And some of these tools are quite advanced. The SEC is using NLP to parse unstructured narrative disclosures like these to predict which brokers are violating the securities laws. But SEC officials make an interesting point. The line-level prosecutors who actually have to bring enforcement actions, they're not impressed by a model's classification of a broker as high risk. They want to know which part of the disclosure triggered that classification and why. And courts want to know why as well. If a judge doesn't get a sufficiently reasoned explanation from an agency, the judge can void the agency's action. Here is where the law presents unique opportunities to AI researchers. State-of-the-art NLP techniques work quite well on short texts, but not nearly so well on long, complicated, and jargony legal opinions. But note that finding the bad apples in narrative disclosures is as much a human challenge as it is a technical one. What is technically feasible, legally permissible, and bureaucratically viable will all have to be worked out in tandem. We can do this, but only if law and computer science can collide in the right ways.
Modernizing the administrative state will require both adapting AI and adapting the law. The stakes are high because trust in government is at an all-time low. Done poorly, we risk fueling resentment of faceless bureaucrats, deepening democratic distrust. Done well, we can build a more effective and human-centered system of law and government. Thank you.
Our next session will be a panel and on the same topic of the impact on society. I would like to introduce our panel moderator, who will then introduce the members of the panel. James Manyika is a senior partner at McKinsey, and he's the chair and director of the McKinsey Global Institute, the company's research arm. He has written and spoken extensively about AI and robotics and serves on a number of academic advisory boards, including the Oxford Internet Institute and the MIT Initiative for the Digital Economy and the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute. James, the floor is yours.
Well, it's hard to talk about the Human-Centered AI Institute, or HAI, without talking about the impacts on humans and on society. So we have an amazing panel to do just that. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce them as they come up. Susan, do you want to come up? Susan Athey is a professor of the economics of technology here at Stanford. She was previously, please feel free to take a seat. She was previously the chief economist at Microsoft and actually works with a lot of technology companies. We also have Kate Crawford. Kate is a writer and researcher and is a professor at NYU. She is the founder of AI Now. We'll talk a little bit about what that is. But Kate has actually spent a lot of time thinking about these large-scale data systems, system challenges, as well as the impact of machine learning and AI. So glad to have Kate here. We also have Tristan Harris. Tristan is a former Googler, but more recently, he is the founder of the Center for Humane Technology. And in fact, many people have often described Tristan as kind of the conscience of Silicon Valley. And I'm sure we'll hear some of that. And then finally, we've got Erik Brynjolfsson. Erik is a professor at MIT at the Sloan School. He's also the founder of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. He's actually currently spending a year on sabbatical here at Stanford. Most of you may know of Erik's book, The Second Machine Age, which talked a lot about the impacts of these things. So we're going to cover some territory here. No surprise, we'll probably touch on issues around the impact on work. We'll probably talk about the impact of AI on society, justice, equity, kinds of concerns. But we'll also ultimately, I think, try to get to these questions about, so who's responsible for making sure all this kind of gets to good outcomes? So what I've asked each of the panelists to do is to spend a couple minutes just giving at least their kind of the key things on their minds when they think about AI's impact on society. Let's start with you, Erik. What's on your mind as you think about the impact on society?
Well, this has been on my mind for a long time. As you mentioned, since I've been working on that book co-authored with Andy McAfee, by the way, I've been amazed by the technological progress. We heard so much about it this morning, and just around in Silicon Valley, a radius around here, you see a lot of it being invented. But at the same time, also some of the challenges and the economic aspects of that. And one of the things that led us to work on this research is that there's no economic law that everyone benefits. And a lot of people were left behind. And that was a little bit of a puzzle when I first looked at it, because clearly the technology is awe-inspiring, but there are also these challenges. That said, I don't want to bury the lead. I do think that the first order effect is tremendous growth in the economic pie, better health, ability to solve so many of our societal problems. If we handle this right, the next 10 years, the next 20 years could be the best couple of decades that humanity has ever seen. Our ability to do the sort of things that Bill Gates and many other people were talking about in healthcare, grow the economy, and individual businesses have been benefiting tremendously. Whether they're unicorns or the trillion-dollar businesses or a lot of startups and some of the things that Fei was talking about with those people out of high school. But on the challenges side, the fact that there's no economic law that everyone benefits means that we need to be proactive about thinking about how we make this shared prosperity. It's possible for some people to be left behind. It's even possible for a majority of people to be left behind. I saw Mark Duggan's slide there showing that median income roughly stagnated for 20 years. And that's not something that happened in previous decades, and something we need to work harder on. And the challenge isn't so much massive job loss. It's more a matter of poor quality jobs and uneven distribution. The technology, we're very far from artificial general intelligence that can do everything, but the technology can do certain tasks extremely well. And if you happen to have a job that mainly does those tasks, you need to think about other things to do. And managers, entrepreneurs need to invent new ways of recombining skills and technology to create value. The problem is that human skills, human institutions, business processes change much more slowly than technology does. Right. And so we're not keeping up on that front. And that's why this human-centered AI initiative is so important, is to help us work on the other side of the HAI challenge, which is how can we adapt our economics, our laws, our societies. Otherwise, we're going to be facing more and more of the unintended consequences. And seeing my fellow panelists here, I'm sure we're going to get into algorithmic bias, fake news, privacy, many of the other challenges that come as side effects of this technology and need to be handled square on. Ultimately, if we don't address them explicitly, then I think other people are going to, there'll be a growing tech backlash. And so this is not only an opportunity to do the right thing, but also a necessity if we want to keep the technology moving forward.
Well, I'm particularly struck by your comment about there's no economic law that guarantees the outcomes and that everybody benefits. I'd love to come back to that at some point as to, so what do we do about that question?
Yeah, that's the key question.
But Susan, you've been thinking about some of these same issues too. What's in your mind when you think about impact on society?
Well, I agree with Erik that we were going to be able to make sort of more outputs with less inputs, and that can potentially be good. But the actual process of translating that into well-being for all is much more challenging. And so one thing that we need to be doing more and better now is to understand why are some people doing badly? What are the forces that are leading to this stagnation? Those questions still have not been completely unpacked despite a fair bit of empirical research. But as we get more and better data and are really better able to measure at a finer level what's going on, where exactly have jobs been disappearing, and why have people not been able to share in this overall growth, those will help us identify the problems. And I think that even though overall the tide may increase, we've seen a lot of economic research that shows that if things start going badly in a particular geography or location, they can also spiral down. People lose their jobs, they go less to the hairdresser, less to the restaurant, and they have less business and so on. So you can certainly have concentrated, especially geographically concentrated harm. And we just have not done a very good job about figuring out how to fix that. And how to smooth those kinds of transitions. And that, I think, takes me to the second thing that I'm thinking about from a positive perspective. AI has this great feature. It's a general purpose technology. So a lot of the commercial incentives have led to huge advances in R&D in the private sector, and we've also seen this great investment within universities. And that R&D can be repurposed to solve social problems. Not that it's going to solve everything, but the thing about digitally delivered services is that they have a very low marginal cost of delivery. And so if we can actually figure out something that works, we can deliver it at scale. And so one thing that I'm really excited about is trying to develop a body of research that can help social impact firms find it easier to get started, collaborations between universities and nonprofits or governments to really help bring these services to the people who need them. And the nice thing about digital services also is this in AI systems generally, is this culture of incremental innovation. So generally, a tech product is not good when it first launches. Instead, you make it better and better and better. You learn, you adapt. The one-size-fits-all isn't great, but once it adapts to the person and really understands them, it can actually really become effective. And so I think there's a whole set of social problems where the conventional wisdom is that we don't have a solution, but we just haven't tried this next set of technologies. And so the university, we have a whole university full of engineers and students of all disciplines who would love to, as part of their education, actually apprentice in solving social problems and doing something impactful instead of just going to target ads in their internship. And so I think we have a great opportunity to harness and leverage that huge desire of people to learn and of researchers to study and direct those towards the problems that might be caused by AI and generally automation and digitization. And then the third point, and I hope we'll come back to this in the discussion further, but is when I spent a lot of time with tech companies, and we can talk a lot about their perverse incentives and how profits might lead them to do things that aren't good for consumers or society. But there's actually a lot of cases where the firms really are mission-driven, and it's actually just hard. It's hard because they're inventing the science, they're inventing the business processes, they're inventing the AI. They're trying to do good, but they just weren't trained to anticipate all of the consequences. And so, it's really incumbent upon us, and this is really a core mission of HI, is to help provide that leadership. One company by themselves, especially small companies, couldn't possibly be expected to have the expertise to anticipate all the different things that their technologies, all the consequences that could follow from their technologies. And so by convening industry and government and academia, I think there's the possibility to really get all the people in the room to start asking the right questions. But that's going to be an ongoing research process. It's not like I could lay out now and say, here are the rules, and if you just do this, your AI will be good. No, instead, the technology is going to progress, and the policy research is going to have to progress right alongside it in an ongoing way. So it's really a process rather than a single final goal.
And I know we're going to come back to these work impacts, because that's clearly a big topic on most people's minds. But as the two resident economists on our panel, Susan and Erik, are you optimistic about the impact on economic growth and productivity?
Yes.
In time. I think that one of the disappointments has been that actually productivity has been pretty dismal the past few years. And that's actually been a little bit of a surprise and disappointment to me. And thinking more about it, and it really gets at some of the things we're doing here at HI, which is that the technologies have been invented. And if you look at their capabilities, you have to be incredibly optimistic. This is one of the great general purpose technologies comparable to the steam engine or electricity. But if you look back, those technologies didn't instantly boost growth. They took decades because new kinds of factories had to be invented, new work rules, whole new institutions had to be invented. And that's what we need to do now as well. And sadly, that takes a lot longer than sometimes inventing the technology.
Do you agree, Susan?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it can be very confusing to follow this space, because on the one hand, you see the AIs playing Go, and the robots climbing the walls and doing backflips, and so you sort of feel like it's like all solved. But then when you look at even the very most advanced tech firms and the most advanced practical implementations, they're still actually relatively primitive. They're using very simple AI, and there's some amazing successes, but across the board, even like personalization and recommendations are still sort of so-so, and those have been the ones that have gotten, in some sense, the most commercial incentive to improve. So I think part of the thing is that we are just very early. It takes a lot of time, and one reason it takes a lot of time is that you have to actually figure out how to measure success. If you're going to climb up a mountain, you need to have a good signal of which way to go. And that's one reason that it actually takes a long time. This isn't a breakthrough in the lab that just immediately is applicable everywhere. The part about putting it into practice is interdisciplinary within a firm and interdisciplinary within science. But we're working on it.
Okay. Well, Kate, you've been thinking a lot about many of these issues related to equity and justice. And well, first of all, tell everybody what AI now is, by the way, so that people
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Thank you, James. So, I've essentially been researching the social implications of machine learning and artificial intelligence and large-scale data for well over a decade now. And about 3 years ago, with Meredith Whittaker, who's also here today, we decided to found basically the world's first institute based at a university dedicated to the social implications of AI. Really because we looked around and we realized that all of the other AI institutes had really a strong focus just on the technical, on algorithms and code. And it was clear to us that this was an incredibly important issue, which is also why we welcome HI here at Stanford as our sister institute on the West Coast. But certainly in the creation of the AI Now Institute, I've got really interested in kind of these sort of core issues around how do we start talking about AI and power? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? Where is it getting concentrated? And who is experiencing the downsides of these systems? We can't really talk about AI without talking about power. It's like talking about nuclear and not talking about weapons. You have to put power at the center of the analysis of how these tools are actually going to affect social institutions. So in terms, to answer your question about the research that I've been excited about and working on, the first one is really, what is the true cost of an AI system? So Often we tend to think about AI systems as quite abstract, as doing a set of optimizations and predictions. But actually, if you really start looking at what is required from a resource perspective, at the GPUs, at the sort of natural mineral resources, and also at the forms of labor that are required right through the chain, right through to the Amazon Turk workers who are often used to train these systems, you see something very different. You see a profoundly resource-intensive set of planetary networks. And again, as many speakers have said today, there are really only very few companies who can do AI at scale. So they really are planetary in that sense. So what we did recently in the Anatomy of AI project with Bidadanure is we did an extensive mapping of everything from the natural resources to the labor resources to the data that it takes to make one Amazon Echo. So that every time you say, Alexa, what's the weather today? You could actually see how much that costs in terms of what's happening in the planet to make that possible. And that really taught me something quite profound about how we start thinking about the sort of the way that these systems really work and how some of these costs are actually hidden. These, particularly these environmental costs and these labor costs, are hidden under very complex logistical and infrastructural systems. The second thing that I think we need to think about is the sort of the cost to civic life and how do we sort of really start to bolster issues that are important to us in civic life. We just published a study that took us well over a year where we looked at 13 jurisdictions in the US that are currently covered by consent decrees or other types of judicial orders because of forms of illegal, biased, or unconstitutional policing. What we found is that in many cases, that dirty data is being imported directly into predictive policing systems. So that means that those systems are actually directing police resources based on illegal data. So that's really got to make us think differently about the types of structural issues in our history, and in this case, particularly structural racism, that is informing the AI tools of the future. And then finally, the thing that I think is also really important to start thinking about is governance. And I know that's something that on this panel we can have a really good conversation about. Certainly, from my perspective, we've been convening leading public interest lawyers and legal thinkers in a group called Litigating Algorithms. So we're looking at all of the cases where algorithmic systems are currently in the justice system and looking at the types of legal strategies that are being used to make sure that these systems are actually accountable. And this hasn't happened before, so it's been an extraordinary research project over many years. So in sum, I guess I would just say this, that I think it's worth thinking about on days like today, is that we often tend to think about AI as inevitable. It's going to be part of all of our systems, whether we like it or not. It will be threaded through our lives. But often I like to sort of ask a different question and say, what type of world do you want to live in? And how do technologies start to serve that vision rather than drive it? So that's one of the big questions I think we should share today and think on.
Yeah, and we might actually come back to you as to what you think, what the vision is that you would like to see. I would love to hear that. But Tristan, you've been thinking, I mean, you made a comment to me when we were talking earlier about how you think a lot about how these technologies could potentially colonize our spaces and the public squares. Say more about what you've been thinking about these kinds of impacts.
Yeah. So I think the question that you're raising about governance is, Marc Andreessen has this phrase that software is eating the world. But really, we're moving to AI, so AI is eating the world. So then the question is, what's governing this thing as it starts to gobble up parts of the world, right? So if you take an area of the world that we used to protect, like Saturday morning cartoons for kids, and then you say, let's let AI eat that part of the world. So YouTube for Kids comes along and it gobbles it up. And then it starts, this digital Frankenstein of YouTube for Kids starts basically directing children to what they watch. 70% of YouTube's traffic now is driven by the AI, the algorithm. So how's it doing? I don't know if any of you have been following this, but it's not doing such a good job. There was videos a week ago about how to commit suicide. It was being directed to children. There's the New Zealand shootings that are just being directed and recommended. It systematically YouTube tilts the landscape towards conspiracy theories and radicalization. So if you imagine a spectrum, you have the sane Walter Cronkite, Carl Sagan side of YouTube, and then you have the crazy town side of YouTube. This is the spectrum. If I'm YouTube and I want you to watch more, which direction am I going to send you? Am I going to send you towards Cronkite or towards Crazy Town? No matter where you start, I'm going to send you that way. So it tilts the entire playing field that way. So if you start a teen girl on a dieting video, she gets recommended anorexia videos. This is a real example. If you start someone on a 9/11 news video, the recommendations are 9/11 conspiracy theories. 15 billion recommendations of 9/11 conspiracy theories by Alex Jones were recommended. So the scope of how much we have delegated to AI, and that was just the Saturday morning cartoon section. We also sort of talk about public politics. Then you get elections, and you say, okay, we used to have this thing called the Federal Elections Commission that says there should be an equal price campaign ad. You know, if it's this much for Hillary Clinton on a Tuesday night, 7 p.m., it should be the same price for Donald Trump. But then you say, let's let Facebook advertising auction systems eat up that part of the world, and so now you have Facebook basically deciding what the prices are, and there's no guarantees for equality. So we basically are taking these areas of life that we used to protect. We had certain values, and we've already just handed over the keys to these systems. So then there's this question of, so how do you govern it? Who's to say, and how are we going to do it? And I really think the best quote that describes the entire situation, that is the problem statement right now, is E.O. Wilson, the father of sociobiology. He said, the problem of humanity, I think he said this 40 years ago, the problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. That's it. We're chimps with lasers, right? We have the power of gods without the wisdom, love, and compassion of gods. So then there's this question again, so these medieval institutions, part of that quote, we don't have sophisticated institutions that know anything about how to deal with these things. Okay, so that's out. Can't really govern it with that perfectly, at least. We certainly want to upgrade it. We have our Paleolithic emotions. We've got the 25-year-olds, with the hoodies. We can let them sort of say what's going to happen, but that hasn't been working so well. And then I want to tell my personal story, which is how I got to be doing what I'm doing and how I'm on this stage. I was a tech entrepreneur, and then I landed at Google through an acquisition, and I basically from the inside of Google back in 2013 saw that what was happening with technology was less and less about building things that help people and more this race to capture human attention. This race to the bottom of the brainstem, who's going to go lower on the brainstem into outrage, fear, self-image hacking, identity, likes, variable schedule rewards, dopamine, all that stuff. And I said, we have this enormous responsibility because not just we Google, but the entire industry is holding up the world's attention. And we're shaping the flows like a big traffic flow diagram. And we have this enormous responsibility to get this right. And this presentation I made at Google went viral to about 10,000 people. And then I became a design ethicist from the inside. And I'm telling you this for a reason, because there's this question of, so if you're inside the companies and you're trying to change things from the inside, how much power do you have? And I say this with no anger or frustration, but I tried to change things from the inside at Google for 2 years. And then I left because I realized fundamentally it was very hard to raise awareness about these issues. This is back in 2013, before the election, before Brexit, before Russian hacking, all these things. So nothing really happened. And so in 2016, I left, and I went on 60 Minutes, the television program, to talk about brain hacking to create public awareness and media pressure around it. And that's when some things started to change. And then, of course, Cambridge Analytica and these external events are really what started to drive the industry. But I wanted to say this because we're looking at this landscape, and we've got these different levers. We've got the medieval institutions, we've got the inside people trying to change things from the inside as best they can against the incentives. But if you're the guy inside of YouTube who says, hey, our recommendation system is systematically steering people towards the crazy stuff, someone we work with, Guillaume Chasleau, has basically tried to raise awareness inside of YouTube on that, and didn't get very far, because YouTube's entire business model is to steer people towards the most engaging stuff. And so it's sort of like you wake up 30 years later and you run the NFL and you're the National Football League, and your scientist comes to you and says, hey, I think that our sport is just basically giving people concussions. And our business model is about selling concussions on TV. We just slam people's heads together and we sell it against advertising. There's not much you can do once you realize that's what the situation you're in. And I think that's the situation that YouTube's in, that's the situation that Facebook's in. And so the pressure has to come from the outside, and we can talk about those different levers, but we've been looking at, there's shareholder pressure, there's media pressure, there's internal employee pressure, there's walkouts, there's a whole bunch of things that can happen, but we have to figure this out.
So that's how you ended up setting up an institution outside to tackle these things.
Yeah.
But I want to come back to, because whenever this topic of AI's impact on society comes up, I think probably the most written about impact tends to be about work. That's been what's been causing a lot of anxiety. And I'm just curious, I want to dig into that a little bit, and then we'll kind of make it conversational. There's one view that says we're facing a jobless future. Another view that says, no, there'll be enough jobs, it's just that the quality of the jobs is what we need to worry about. And then there's other views about, no, we can skill our way through this. I'm just curious, Susan and Erik in particular, you've been thinking a lot about this work jobs question. What, in a nutshell, to the extent that we can in a panel, so we're not going to go to great depth, but what's your view on the work question? Either one of you.
So maybe I can just start with a few facts, and I think Erik has really done more of his own research on this, so I'm kind of reporting other people's research here. But Hal Varian's a famous economist. We had a conference here recently about the future of work, and he made this nice presentation about, he called it bots and tots. So bots are the robots, and tots are kids. And a nice observation that he made is that it's fairly easy to predict how many 40-year-olds there will be 30 years from now. We kind of know, we can predict pretty accurately demographic trends. Of course, we might change immigration policy. And in fact, after you watch this presentation, the first thing you want to do is expand immigration. Because he's actually pointing out that we're going to have, across a lot of developed countries, aging societies and an absence of workers. And in fact, the contraction of the labor market, he argues, is a larger quantitative effect than the most aggressive job loss from automation. Right. So these are kind of back of the envelope calculations, governed by data, and this is, again, not my research, but I think it's an interesting question to start asking. You need to think about these in general equilibrium. You can't just look at one side of supply and demand. And then if you kind of peel this apart a little bit more micro, old people actually require a lot of labor. Anyone who has brought somebody through hospice or through a long battle with an illness will know this. And so if we think about sort of forgetting about who pays for it, if we think about not having enough jobs, roughly for sick elderly people, you could have sort of 1 or 2 human workers per patient productively employed. Of course, this is now kind of unpaid work, which is pretty tough work for the people who are doing it. And which then ends up transferring people into nursing homes and other forms of care, which are incredibly expensive. So if we think about, employing people, we can employ people to take care of people in a very productive way. Now, technology can help because, of course, one reason it's so expensive to have home health aides is you worry about errors. And technology can actually dispense drugs. It can monitor and surveil. It can alert you if there is any type of change in your health state. So over time, it may be easier actually to have, say, older people take care of older people, for that matter, in a safe way, and also solve the physical problems. Now think about young people. We can also pretty productively employ human labor teaching young people. And anyone who's raised children knows that you can productively employ about one adult per child, and maybe 2. And so, again, I just think that when you look at it that way, will there be a positive marginal product for human labor in the future, given our demographics? Of course there will be. The question is really then, how do you pay for it? And that could involve, for example, more government reimbursement of home health aides and other types of policies, as well as development of technology and training the workforce to be appropriate for these types of jobs. Right. So I think if you just look at these basic demographics, you start to realize that actually this idea that we're all just going to go to the beach and the robots will do everything doesn't seem quite as plausible.
Yeah, Erik, you worry a lot about the quality of jobs, much more than absence of jobs, right?
I mean, to build on what Susan said, a lot of it is going to depend on the time frame, and I think too many people jump to this Hollywood artificial general intelligence scenario where machines can just do everything. And first off, even if they could, I mean, that shouldn't be bad news. If we have massive wealth without much need for work, we should be able to figure out a way to make that be a good thing. It'd be sad if we didn't. But that really isn't the challenge that we face right now, and I don't think it's a challenge we're going to face anytime soon. We're so far from artificial general intelligence that and there's so many things that humans are uniquely good at doing. When I look around, I see so many tasks that need to be done in childcare, healthcare, cleaning the environment, in creative work, in scientific work, in arts, and I could go on many other things that only humans can do right now, and only humans will be able to do for some time. So the challenge is, as machines become better and better at doing certain types of tasks, narrow AI in certain areas, how do we redeploy, reskill, reinvent goods, services, tasks to send people in that new direction? Because it's not necessarily the same people in those two different categories.
Can we reskill everybody?
We could reskill a lot more than we are doing right now. I think you have to work on both sides of it. You can use AI, as was mentioned, to help with the reskilling, and we can be more thoughtful about the kinds of things. But also, another half of it is entrepreneurs inventing things for people to do that use their existing skills. And there's an opportunity there as well. It's not something that necessarily professors or policymakers are very good at, but one of the great things about a capitalist system is we have lots of people trying out lots of different ways of solving problems and inventing lots of new goods and services. And one of the surprising things that the research shows is that we actually have less entrepreneurship, less new business formation, fewer younger firms now than we did 10, 20, and 30 years ago. So there's actually been a more of a stagnation and a slowing down on redeploying people. And that is just as bad as the lack of reskilling people. But if we did more on those sides, I think that, there's, as I said earlier, there's no shortage of work for humans to do if we were able to redeploy them more effectively. And the technology right now is too often being used simply to automate certain kinds of tasks, leaving people without work in those areas, and not often enough used to create the new opportunities.
Kate, you've written a lot about these issues of, again, equity and power and so forth. And one of the things you've highlighted a lot in a lot of your work is the fact that part of the challenge, in fact, you gave an example just now, is in the underlying data that we use to train these algorithms, and its collection and its validity and this. What do we do about that?
Well, I mean, this is a really hard question because there's, as you know, a massive race right now to collect all of the forms of data that there can be, cognitive, biological, you name it, to feed AI systems that can start to detect large-scale patterns. But of course, all of those forms of data come with a history, and they come from a deep social context. And I think the attempt to try and deracinate that social context from where that data came from and how it was generated is actually going to generate a set of problems for us. But there's another question too, which is, I think, a really important one that is sort of hovering over this wish to make the AI industry more ethical, is that we could actually look to the social sciences, where we have a long history of institutional review and ethical review around how you generate and use data. So using somebody's image, or classifying humans, or using their words, or anything that they've created. These things have to go through a review process. Now, right now, in the production of AI, we don't have any review processes like that are established at universities, and very few in industry, although there are a few that are starting to emerge. So I think we've actually got some really hard questions to say, if we want to make AI more robust and more ethical, we have to start thinking about these data collection practices. And this is something that we've been doing a lot of work on. I know several people in the room are really interested to do more research in this. And I think, frankly, it is going to be one of the biggest problems we hit. I mean, certainly our predictive policing study really shocked me to see that data that was supposed to be completely off the record. I mean, this was illegal data. This was like corrupt police practices. This was like planting evidence on people. And these points become data inside a predictive policing system that reorient how surveillance is actually working and where resources are being spent. So I've really sort of been thinking very hard about where else we can see these types of I guess you'd call them types of sort of data circles, where things are sort of feeding back into systems, and what we can do about it.
Well, one of the questions that underlies a lot of this, and there's been quite a lot of work, as you know, and actually by some people in this room, they link this issue of bias and fairness with needing to specify fairness. Can we actually ever specify fairness? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what other panelists think, but certainly, I mean, this is something that is extremely tough, because there's a desire to come up with a quantitative metric for fairness. Right. And guess what? There isn't one. And so what we're starting to see is this sort of construction of like tweaking algorithmic systems to create parity. Now, parity is not fairness. Just because a system works exactly the same on people with lighter skin and darker skin does not mean that we are currently using that system in a fair way. So we have to ask, I think, questions about justice much more than we should be asking these questions about, is it fair or does it produce parity?
So Erik, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is, I think, an opportunity on two fronts. There's these challenges that Kate brought up, but I want to say also that in most cases, the reason that these systems are biased is because they learned from biased humans. And the alternative usually isn't a perfect system if the alternative is relying on humans who judges and hiring and HR officers who are biased. That isn't necessarily an improvement. What I see as an opportunity here is that it's often easier to improve the algorithms and to check the algorithms and to remove the bias from them. So if we do this right, recognizing that there are problems there, we have a chance to do better than we have in the past. The other thing that's subtler is also very important. Your question about how do we define fairness is that when we write these systems, it forces us to confront what our real goals are, what our real values are. A lot of that gets blurred when people are making a decision in a blink of an eye or in a private hiring thing. But when you code it into a system, it forces you to think about what is fairness. And you and I had a conversation. Actually, I'd like to hear your views if we can turn this around a little bit, because you were telling me that there were what, 22 different metrics of...
Well, there's a fun paper out there where somebody tried to actually understand, different definitions of fairness that you could actually try and code, and they came up with about 21 different specifications for fairness, and they're all incompatible with each other.
That's the real challenge, and it forces us to, as philosophers, as citizens, decide, okay, how do we want to balance these different things? We can't just sweep it under the rug. We have to be explicit about these trade-offs.
But I also think that they get at the question maybe that's at the heart of this conversation, which is, at some point I imagine we have to be clear about what society we want and what outcomes we want.
That's to be the ultimate question.
Right, and I'm just curious what you as panelists think is the future we want in a human-centered...
So one thing about this, I think that, actually Kate and I got to know each other trying to think about these issues in real applications, but one of the challenges is that this is really a social science kind of question. And so I think it's actually less surprising to social scientists that you can't have your cake and eat it too, or that you can't have everything when it comes to fairness. This is something that we've thought about for a long time. And so, of course, there's many different approaches to it. An economist might think about it in terms of outcomes. So when I think about fairness and everything from college admissions to employment and so on, one thing you care about is incentives. And so one notion of fairness might be really good for motivating people to work hard, to make everybody feel like if they work hard, they have a chance. Right. And so if your main idea is to motivate effort and investment, then you might focus on one thing, while in other contexts, it might be that you want to take people where they are and treat them fairly, either because of legal reasons or it's some concept of justice. So it's really context specific. And if you think about even like in a platform, even something like Facebook or a marketplace, it's actually, you end up sometimes being unfair. You might be unfair to new service providers on Airbnb because they might provide a bad experience to your customers. Right. So you actually have to think harder about it's not just fairness, it's what are you trying to accomplish? You're trying to maybe create a platform that works for everybody, that's safe, and so on. So you have all these complicated objectives, and then to translate those objectives into rules and metrics that guide a system is incredibly hard. So even putting aside whatever poor incentives you think firms have, even if they're really trying to do the right thing, it's not like we have the playbook and we can just say, okay, here, this is how you do it right. Not at all. Right. Which is why it's got to be a research. This is a research endeavor. It's a research enterprise. It's a program that we need to develop over a period of time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say two things in relation to Erik's point that, essentially, we can make code that is somehow sort of fair and less biased than humans. But who's inspecting that code? Who's looking at it? That code is being produced often inside very few companies that have an enormous amount of power that are basically creating proprietary algorithms. So you're not really able to audit that. It doesn't have a sort of a public transparency rule. So where is accountability coming in? That's the first question. The second question is, even though, yes, human institutions are frail and sometimes medieval, we have, since the 1500s, developed a couple of things that are really handy. One of them is called due process. We currently have no due process when it comes to how an algorithmic system is deciding whether or not you should be released from jail, whether or not you should be getting Medicare in home, whether or not you should be getting your child into university. So realistically, these systems are currently operating outside of due process. That's a major problem. Secondly, institutions have all sorts of appeal mechanisms. So even if a judge makes a decision on a day where he hasn't had lunch and he's feeling grumpy, you can actually appeal that decision. You can see how the decision was made. There's a text to work from. These are not things that we currently have with the algorithmic systems that are already impacting so many sensitive social institutions, from healthcare to education to criminal justice. So as much as I think it's lovely to say, hey, algorithms can be less biased than people, until we have accountability and due process mechanisms, we're actually setting up a trap.
Well, let me ask you, Kate, maybe the panel a question. But in a lot of these questions we're talking about, whether principles or due process or any of these mechanisms to deal with these issues, these technologies are operating at global scale.
Exactly.
Across multiple countries, multiple cultures, multiple systems. How do we square the circles here? Because some technologies invented here will be applied over there and vice versa. How do you think about these societal questions in a global context?
To me, that's the core challenge. I mean, just to say also on the bias and discriminating data sets, the data set that's used to power the entire internet is called the click. And the click is the source of authority in the entire internet. We build up our entire systems off of that. And then we, in Silicon Valley, with a libertarian mindset, say that's just giving people what they want. And so in 2016, there was this mysterious keyword that when Facebook sort of showed people news articles, if it had this one keyword in it, it would always get clicked and it would always get shared. And so it just kept giving people what they wanted. And that keyword was Trump. And I say this not saying that from a biased political perspective, I'm just saying that's how the algorithm worked, but from its perspective, that's the discriminating police data set. But we just hauled back this entire invisible sociological history. So now, several years later, I know from people inside of Facebook, that they try to do this stuff to depolarize the system, to make it more fair in your nervous system. So instead of pulling from the bottom of the brainstem, let's maybe pull from somewhere else. Let's try to change polarization. But it turns out people aren't clicking on the less polarizing stuff, to the point where I heard from a person, very senior, that they're asking, well, maybe people just want to be polarized. Now that's like saying, well, maybe those African Americans who we piped in through that data set 5 generations ago and hauled them through the system until now, maybe they really are just more criminal, right? And so the problem is, and Baudrillard wrote about this, the French philosopher, you keep hauling through these biases through history until you wake up and it's 2019, we think bacon and eggs go together, but that was actually a marketer's invention that married 2 products together to sell better, propagates through culture. Now that's a norm and we forgot where it came from, and we're kind of living in this new reality. And then to your point, so now you have this global version of it, so you can have an appeals process. But then you have 2 billion individual, if you take the YouTube case or Facebook case, you have 2 billion programmed Truman shows, 2 billion individual channels. How many engineers at Facebook speak Burmese, where there's a genocide going on because of the fake news there? How many engineers at YouTube speak the 22 languages of India, where there's an election coming up in May? So now, and then how many people would they have to hire to deal with all the appeals processes, all the due process, all of that? Like what's going on is, again, we've created the godlike technology with a mathematical incompatibility of all these channels without the kind of loop back around.
Well, maybe one question, then we'll shift to the audience for questions, but maybe one to ruminate on. As we think about all these, clearly there's lots of opportunities. You've all pointed to the opportunities, and we heard a lot about that earlier in the day, but you've also pointed to all these challenges. Where does the responsibility lie? I mean, because you've got the technologists inventing, the scientists inventing these technologies. Some of them are private companies, some of them are labs, some of them are academic institutions. You've got policymakers, you've got regulators. Where does the responsibility lie?
So I think that it is, I understand the concerns that we've seen in our society, but to be fair to the firms, some of these problems are actually pretty hard. So I've certainly tackled myself problems in industry where I wanted to do a better job getting away from the click. Actually, a bunch of my work was about getting measures that got away from a click, because even if you're trying to make people happy, the click actually is not a good measure of making them happy. But the problem is that measuring what does make them happy is difficult, slow, noisy. If I want to see, is a person still with me 6 months from now, I would need to wait 6 months. So actually, just the process of operationalizing AI for long-term objectives is actually quite tricky. So one thing I talk a lot about in my executive education about AI is that, hey, this technology, no matter what your objective is, it's going to make you be more short-term focused. Why? Because the technology is something that you want to optimize, you want to measure quickly. And so you're going to need to find short-term proxies, and those short-term proxies miss things. And so part of, I think, guiding the whole process of guiding AI to be more beneficial is to realize that there's more tools than just the technology, just what you measure. Maybe you put rules. So if the New York Times just maximized for clicks, the entire front page would be full of celebrity stuff within a day.
Or worse.
But they actually do have rules. Like certain things can't be entered into the competition for clicks on the front page. And the leaders talk to the writers about what is consistent with the New York Times and help shape the content in those ways. So I think ultimately we're going to have to mix methods. We're going to have methods of guidance and regulation. We're going to have human inputs, oversight that compensate for the parts that the AI systems don't fully do. And so I guess in terms of the responsibility, partly we're here because I think that we feel that there's a collective responsibility, that it's not, you can't, no one actor, no university, no scientist sitting in his lab at 3 a.m. trying to show up a problem on a tech firm, no government by themselves will get this right. First of all, we have to bring up the level of the discourse by making sure everybody knows what they're talking about and create conceptual frameworks. And then the real work begins of actually trying to figure out the answers.
Right. Well, let's go to the audience for questions. So please put up your hand if you have a question for the panel. There's one in the back there.
Hello, thank you for the terrific remarks. My name is Mitchell Stevens. I'm a sociologist here in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. I want to refer back to Bill Gates' remarks earlier and push you all a little bit more on where we're going on this question of governance. In the 1890s, when we were facing massive technological change, the United States and Northern European countries created the regulatory apparatus that we now inherit at the beginning of the 21st century. And during the Cold War, when there was another massive wave of technological investment, nation-state governments were unequivocally in charge of where technological progress, as we called it at the time, was being directed. And it's evident from the conversations here that this moment of technological change is not being controlled by any nation state, right? Nor is any nation state claiming definitive jurisdiction over it. So how do we think about governing a technology when nation states themselves are agnostic about their ability to control it?
So I don't necessarily agree that it's just the responsibility of the nation states, or that it was in those earlier eras. There were tremendous inventions in public school and antitrust and a lot of other things that this nation in particular, but many nations invented to grapple with technological change and later. But there are also cultural changes. There were labor unions. Businesses had different sets of ethics and propagated those. And I think that a similar thing today, I think the answer to your question has to be all of us get involved. I was talking recently with a technologist developing some AI technologies, and she was saying, it's not my responsibility how these things get used. I just try to invent the best technologies. That was a couple of years ago. I'd be very surprised if she still said that today, because I think partly because of the work at AI Now and HI and other organizations and just the ethos, it's become clear that we can't abdicate those responsibilities. When we invent these powerful technologies, whether it's the fire, later we get burned and invent fire extinguishers, or cars, we invent seatbelts. With the social media, we saw the 2016 election and other hacking attempts. Sometimes belatedly, we come around thinking, okay, we need to adjust those. And if we have an algorithm that's just tuned to optimize clicks, in the short run, yeah, that maximizes engagement, maybe you get more ads. And then you realize that even for the firm itself, it's not necessarily profit maximizing. The firm itself is being hurt, and certainly society's being hurt. And so each of those different levels is going to look at it and respond to it. And just to make things a little thornier, my colleague Sinan Aral did some work, and Deb Roy and others did some work on the spread of fake news on Twitter. And it does indeed spread 6 times faster than truth does. But it's not because it's fake. It's not like people say, oh, that's fake, let me spread that. It's because it's so much more engaging. It's unbelievable. It's amazing.
Funny that.
But here's the unfortunate thing is, they could identify the bots in the network. They took the bots out and synthetically said, well, how fast would it have spread if you didn't have the bots? Just as fast, because it was the humans who were really the bad actors there deciding to spread this. So it even ultimately forces us not just to change our institutions, our laws, our incentives, but to think about our own values and think, okay, are we doing the right thing? How can we spend our time better?
But Erik, I want to follow. I mean, in some ways, that's a good way to think about it from the point of view of these use and misuse questions. But I'm also curious on this responsibility question, what you all think about the responsibility to things that have an economic impact. So I'm thinking about the massive amount of retraining that's going to be needed, the skilling, the workforce effects, the wage effects. Who is responsible for those?
Again, I'll just briefly say it's all those levels. So I would love to see the U.S. government and all the governments doing more, but there are companies that are, at MIT we have something called the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, which recognizes, rewards organizations that are creating more shared prosperity. And there are many companies I'm not going to start naming them because then I'll leave so many off the list. And they're nonprofit organizations, but I really think it would be a mistake for any of us to point to, oh, that's that other institution's job to do it. And each of us individually can, as citizens, as voters, as CEOs, as workers, as professors, play a role.
But we have a question there, just quickly on this idea of like, we are all responsible, is to really ask, who is that we? Who is the we who has the power to really have a say here? And we're actually talking a pretty limited set of actors. And we could even sort of look around this room and say, who's not present? Which communities are not represented here? And that can often really generate some really interesting insights about who that sort of putative we might be. And certainly in terms of who's taking responsibility at the moment, we've seen some extraordinary public protests against a lot of issues that have been coming out of technology companies.
That's what
new.
I'm talking about. Yeah.
We've seen a technology workers movement. We've seen an extraordinary shift of people demanding responsibility. So I think both the public sector and the private sector are really going to have to start thinking a lot harder about what that's going to look like. And Susan actually was the first person to mention the word regulation. I mean, we've heard people like Brad Smith at Microsoft really start to say, hey, how are we going to regulate these technologies? That's a first. So, I mean, I think it's really the right moment to start talking about things like facial recognition. That's going to be very, very hard to basically regulate just through the private sector or the public sector. We actually need to start coming up with much bigger rubrics, and some of those are going to have to be international. But we've done it before. We can look at what happened with nuclear. You can look at bodies like the IAEA that actually looked at things like inspections into systems as ways of generating an international consensus to produce peace. We're going to need similarly big picture ideas this time.
Can I say that I think, so just the firms, I think, are perhaps more motivated for regulation than you might think. So if you put yourself in the position of a bank and you start using AI, you suddenly discover all sorts of things. So you might discover that you can just putting people into clusters, that there's a cluster and then you look at it and it looks like these people are gambling or they have an alcohol addiction or they have some other thing, just looking at expenditure data. Now, they may not have set out to find that, and that might have been, group number 223, but now it's all documented, and it's in the records. And a regulator 3 years later might come back and decide that you did something wrong because you didn't act on information that you had. And similarly, you're going to be writing down in code these risks that you're taking. So it actually exposes firms to a whole new set of risks that they really can't understand, because 5 years from now it's going to get sorted out in litigation, whether or not when these documents are subpoenaed, a jury decides that they acted improperly. So I think that really this desire for sort of sensible guidance and regulation will not be controversial among the folks who are struggling with these issues.
Let's get maybe one last question.
Hello, I'm Marina. I'm a journalism fellow at Stanford. I wanted to ask about sources of funding for AI. And we see that a lot of the sources of funding are concentrated in a handful of companies and a handful of governments. And I wanted to ask how that reality clashes with the aspiration that we have to build a more inclusive, a more fair, and a more independent artificial intelligence.
Does anybody want to take that? Funding question.
Well, just there's not that many people who are free to just speak the truth in all circumstances. And so I think the fact that if Google and Facebook are funding the majority of AI research, then that presents a lot of huge problems, for sure. I will say in this last question as well that we're really just lacking the institutions that provide this accountability. I mean, I know the people personally who stayed up till 3 in the morning scanning the data sets, working for nonprofit salaries, or if that, or fellowships at Mozilla or something, trying to calculate, what these problems are. And that's how, and then it's through that kind of research that then you try to get a congressman to say, hey, we got to have a hearing, and that's how you get the hearing to happen. And you don't want civilians with no resources being the sole accountability structure for these massive systems. So what we're really talking about is we need structural accountability systems that we all agree that we would be better off having. And that's the question that I think that this institution, we're trying to answer.
Completely agree, and I just say thank you for that question. I mean, this issue of power concentration, as I said at the outset, is one of the biggest issues facing AI. I mean, we often talk about the big 7 in the US, and if you include China in that, you might be talking about really less than a dozen companies that are really powerful enough to be using AI at scale. And of course, there are a set of leading universities, including this one, who have been really important in sort of driving that. But that's still an extremely concentrated field, and it's really a small group of people who really have their hands on the levers of power in this sort of discussion. So when we start to talk about what that looks like geopolitically, it actually starts to look very concerning, where you start to see power really concentrated in the hands of, really depending how you count, between 3 to 4 nations, where everybody else is being relegated to become a client state. That's actually something we have to work against. We really have to think very carefully about what geopolitical power is going to look like over the next 50 years. But it's a great question.
Well, I think if nothing else, this panel has reinforced one thing, which is why we need a HI, because these issues are very multidisciplinary and cover all the disciplines that are going to be included in HI. But on that note, thank you to the panelists for the conversation.